October 8, 1941, Moscow. A typewritten order crossed the desk at Soviet Air Force headquarters on a grey autumn morning when German forces stood 50 miles from the Kremlin. GKO Order Number 99 bore Stalin's signature and a single revolutionary mandate: form 3 aviation regiments staffed entirely by women: pilots, navigators, armorers, mechanics. Pre-war doctrine had never anticipated female combat aviators beyond auxiliary roles, yet the directive demanded operational units with frontline deployment schedules. Marina Raskova, already celebrated as a hero of the Soviet Union for her record-breaking polar flights, received authorization to recruit and train the cadres. Within weeks, thousands of applications arrived at Moscow recruitment centers from factory workers, students, teachers, and parachute instructors. The order promised all-female formations. Within a year, operational realities would force compromises in 2 regiments, but one unit, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would fly fabric biplanes into history and never yield that original vision. On the morning of October 8, 1941, an Air Force clerk positioned State Defense Committee Order Number 99 among the day's distribution stack at headquarters in Moscow. The document, signed by Stalin as chairman of the GKO, specified formation of 3 aviation regiments with unprecedented staffing parameters. Women would fill every position from regimental commander to ground crew mechanic. The marginalia noted target strength, aircraft types, and training timelines. Unlike emergency mobilizations that threw undertrained personnel into gaps, this order designated specific aircraft models for each regiment: Yak-1 fighters for air defense, P-2 twin-engine bombers for tactical strike, and Po-2 biplanes for night harassment operations. Engels Air Base, on the Volga in Saratov Oblast, would serve as the consolidated training center. Soviet military doctrine before June 1941 had acknowledged women in support roles: medical personnel, communications specialists, anti-aircraft crews. Combat aviation, however, remained exclusively male in official planning. The German invasion shattered many assumptions. By October, the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses in personnel and materiel. Order Number 99 represented both an ideological statement and a pragmatic calculation. Marina Raskova, named organizer and initial commander, already held recognition as one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished aviators. In September 1938, she had navigated a 3-woman crew on a record-breaking flight from Moscow to the Soviet Far East, earning the first Hero of the Soviet Union awards granted to women. Her celebrity and credibility gave the program legitimacy. The order unlocked immediate bureaucratic priority: requisitions for aircraft, fuel allocations, training slot reservations, and barracks space moved through channels that were otherwise choked by competing wartime demands. Within days, recruitment notices circulated in newspapers and at Komsomol meetings across unoccupied Soviet territory. Applications flooded Moscow from young women with glider experience, parachute training, or simply determination to contribute directly to combat operations. Raskova and her staff winnowed thousands of applicants to approximately 400 selectees. The same document that mandated all-female staffing would, within 12 months, show penciled annotations recording the addition of male specialists to the fighter and bomber regiments. Maintenance complexity, command succession after Raskova's death in January 1943, and tactical integration pressures drove those adjustments. Yet the Night Bomber Regiment, designated 588th, later redesignated 46th Guards, maintained its original composition throughout the war, a fact that would distinguish it sharply from its sister units. The first cadets arrived at Engels Air Base in November 1941, as winter settled over the Volga steppe. A chalkboard in the main briefing room displayed the compressed training syllabus: basic flight, instrument procedures, night circuits, navigation, bombing technique, armament handling, and field maintenance. Standard peacetime pipelines for Soviet military aviators ran 12 to 18 months. The war permitted no such luxury. Raskova's staff designed a program measured in weeks for the Po-2 night bomber track and a few months for the more complex Yak-1 and P-2 aircraft. Instructors drawn from operational squadrons and reserve cadres faced cohorts of women whose ages ranged from late teens to mid-20s. Some brought civilian flying credentials, others had logged only a handful of hours in gliders or club aircraft. The pace allowed little time for polish. Each day began before dawn with ground school, navigation, meteorology, radio procedures, aircraft systems, followed by flight periods that extended into darkness. Cadets rotated through gunnery ranges, learned to load and fuse bombs, and drilled on engine troubleshooting with minimal tools under field conditions. The Po-2, the biplane designated for night harassment missions, embodied simplicity. Designed in the late 1920s by Nikolai Polikarpov as a primary trainer, It featured an open cockpit, fabric-covered airframe, and a 5-cylinder Shvetsov M11 radial engine producing 100 horsepower. Maximum speed barely exceeded 150 kilometers per hour. The aircraft's short-field performance allowed operations from grass strips, forest clearings, and roads. Two-person crews, pilot in the forward cockpit, navigator in the rear, could conduct multiple sorties per night because ground crews could refuel and rearm in minutes using hand pumps and simple bomb racks. Training accidents occurred, as they did in any accelerated program. Early November brought weather-related incidents when cadets encountered instrument conditions beyond their experience. Raskova's staff revised procedures, emphasized weather minimums, and instituted stricter pre-solo check rides. Graduation lists from December 1941 recorded passing cohorts by date and aircraft type. On December 9th, the fighter track graduated its first group, evidence that pipeline speed, not aircraft sophistication, would determine when regiments could deploy. The Night Bomber students practiced circuits under blackout conditions using hooded lamps to mark runway edges. They flew low-level navigation runs over the winter landscape, learning to navigate by terrain features, rivers, and road networks visible in moonlight or starlight. Bomb-loading drills taught them to handle 25-kilogram, 50-kilogram, and 100-kilogram ordnance, fit fuse extenders, and calculate release points from altitude and airspeed. By late December, enough two-person crews had qualified to form the core of 3 squadrons. Through the winter and early spring of 1942, instructors at Engels and forward dispersal fields refined the night harassment doctrine that would define Po-2 operations. An observer watching a Po-2 on trestles as an armorer fitted fuse extenders to small bombs might have dismissed the aircraft as obsolete. A fabric biplane designed for training, pressed into combat roles by desperation. That assessment missed the aircraft's operational advantages in a specific tactical niche. At night, the Po-2's limitations became strengths. Its low stall speed, less than 60 kilometers per hour, meant it could loiter over a target area at speeds well below those at which German night fighters operated efficiently. Bf-110 and Ju-88 crews struggled to engage targets flying so slowly. Firing passes required precision approaches at speeds that risked stalls or overshoots. The Po-2's wooden and fabric structure presented minimal radar cross-section to early German radar sets, and its small size made visual acquisition difficult in darkness. Typical bomb loads ranged around 350 kilograms, distributed among several small bombs. Pilots learned to idle the engine during the final approach, gliding the last few hundred meters to reduce acoustic warning. Ground crews marked targets by their lights, supply depots, bivouacs, rail yards, and vehicle concentrations, and by the muzzle flashes of anti-aircraft guns once the attacks began. Multi-ship formations staggered their approaches to disrupt searchlight and anti-aircraft coordination, forcing German defenders to track multiple slow-moving targets simultaneously. Field maintenance required no specialized facilities. Ground crews worked with basic tools to service engines, patch fabric, and replace control cables. The aircraft's simplicity meant high availability rates even under austere conditions. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who would command the regiment through the war, emphasized that the Po-2's constraints, payload, speed, altitude, mandated a doctrine built on frequency and persistence, rather than per-sortie lethality. Soviet night bombing instructions, refined by early 1942, codified these practices. Luftwaffe reports from the same period noted increasing difficulties engaging very low, very slow targets, particularly when attacks came in waves throughout the night. German night fighter units recorded abortive intercepts against Po-2s whose speed envelope fell below the optimum parameters for cannon or machine gun fire. The fabric biplane, initially perceived as a stopgap, began to demonstrate that in the right operational context, simplicity and availability could compensate for limited striking power. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment deployed to southern front sectors in June 1942. An operations board at the forward airstrip tallied nightly missions in chalk, takeoff times, landing times, turnaround intervals, bomb loads, and target coordinates. Staff officers initially expected marginal effects from small bombs delivered by obsolete biplanes. Regimental after-action reports and sector-level Air Army summaries told a different story. Crews flew 8 to 12 sorties per night during routine operations. During offensives or defensive crises, individual crews logged up to 18 sorties in a single night, returning to rearm and refuel in rapid cycles. Short flight legs, often measured in minutes rather than hours, allowed this tempo. Ground crews worked under blackout conditions, using hooded lamps and practiced routines to turn aircraft around quickly. Bomb loads mixed incendiaries and fragmentation ordnance depending on target type, Fuel and ammunition dumps received incendiaries, troop concentrations and vehicle parks received fragmentation. Daily Air Army summaries through the summer of 1942 recorded cumulative effects. Fuel trucks destroyed, fires at rail sidings, interrupted road columns, and damaged depots. German field reports noted the disruption. Soldiers lost sleep as attacks recurred throughout the night. Repair teams found themselves working extended shifts to restore severed communication lines, fill craters, and extinguish fires. Rear area efficiency degraded measurably. Within a single week in late August, the regiment's cumulative small attacks forced a German division-level staff to divert anti-aircraft guns and repair units from forward positions to protect rear installations. Sector commanders on the Soviet side requested continued night pressure on specific choke points, bridges, crossroads, and supply nodes, observing that even when physical damage was modest, the psychological and operational toll on German rear area personnel proved significant. Named crews began appearing in squadron rosters and sector reports as commanders tracked performance and sortie counts. The Po-2 doctrine proved itself through repetition. No single attack delivered decisive effects, but hours-long rest denial and persistent small-scale damage accumulated into measurable operational degradation. The regiment demonstrated that tactical harassment, executed with high sortie rates and persistence, could influence the tempo and efficiency of enemy rear operations in ways that larger, less frequent strikes could not replicate. By October 1942, the 588th operated from forward grass strips near the Stalingrad approaches, where supply lines stretched thin and logistics staffs struggled to sustain frontline units. A spares ledger in red ink showed critical shortages: replacement engines, propellers, control cables, fabric patches. Ground crews practiced battlefield maintenance, cannibalizing one damaged airframe to return two others to flight status. Anticipated supply shocks threatened operational tempo, yet distributed stocks, improvised repairs, and simplified inspection protocols kept launch rates high. Yevdokia Bershanskaya commanded the regiment with an emphasis on availability and mission completion. Navigators such as Polina Gelman, whose names would later appear on award citations and roster records, logged hundreds of sorties through the autumn and winter. Fuel consumption per sortie remained predictable. The M11 engine's modest power translated into modest fuel burn. Bomb dumps forward of the main airstrip allowed quick rearming without extensive ground movement. Two-person crews simplified manning calculations, and the Po-2's ground handling characteristics permitted operations from rough fields with minimal engineering preparation. Quartermaster tables from this period show weapon loads correlated to target types. Regimental maintenance logs recorded mean time to repair common faults, carburetor icing, ignition wire failures, fabric tears, and noted that most issues could be resolved without pulling the aircraft from service for extended periods. This lean logistics model enabled disproportionate operational persistence compared to more complex night bomber types that required dedicated maintenance facilities and specialized spares. Computed loss rates per 1,000 sorties remained lower than those experienced by frontline day bomber regiments, despite operations from austere strips within range of German artillery and ground forces. Factors contributing to survivability included the low-altitude, low-speed flight regime that complicated engagement, the cover of darkness, and dispersed basing that reduced the risk of catastrophic losses to a single attack on a concentrated airfield. Attrition occurred: weather, navigation errors, light anti-aircraft fire, and operational accidents claimed aircraft and crews, but at rates that allowed the regiment to sustain high sortie tempos without depleting its strength. The regiment's operational persistence became its defining characteristic. While other units cycled between intensive operations and stand-down periods for rest and reconstitution, the 588th maintained pressure on German rear areas night after night through the Stalingrad battles and into the winter of 1943. From January through June 1943, the regiment operated across Don and Caucasus rear areas, targeting German logistics and rest cycles. A sector rail movement officer crossed out a repair schedule and reissued it for night shifts after repeated attacks damaged rolling stock and disrupted traffic. Searchlight batteries received revised alert rosters to maintain coverage throughout the night. German rear area staffs initially downrated the Po-2's lethality, categorizing night harassment as a nuisance rather than a serious threat. Accumulated reports told a different story. Sleep disruption compounded over weeks. Soldiers whose rest cycles were interrupted nightly showed measurable performance degradation. Fires at timber depots, ammunition sheds, and refueling points required repair battalions and firefighting details that otherwise would have been available for frontline tasks. German sector reviews documented missed train throughput targets and correlated them directly with Soviet night bomber activity. In one documented case, a sector-level analysis linked 4 consecutive weeks of substandard rail performance to nightly Po-2 incursions. Soviet after-action reports noted coordination between night attack planning and ground operations. Army engineers timed demolition parties to strike targets that had been softened by night bombing. Lit crossings, where German engineers worked to restore bridge capacity under floodlights, became priority targets. Incendiary loads against exposed timber structures caused fires that extended repair timelines. Ammunition stocks left in open or lightly protected depots proved vulnerable to fragmentation and incendiary attack. German rear area complaints about night harassment appeared in unit logs and situation reports. Anti-aircraft allocations shifted toward rear installations. Patrol schedules expanded. Repair unit taskings grew. Each reallocation represented resources that could have been applied at the forward edge of battle. The compounding effect, small bombs, frequent attacks, persistent pressure, forced German staffs to make trade-offs between rear security and forward combat power. The regiment's contribution to the broader operational picture became clearer through this period. It did not deliver knockout blows or destroy major formations, but it imposed costs in sleep, repair hours, diverted personnel, and degraded logistics throughput that accumulated into measurable effects. Sector-level data confirmed that night harassment extended timelines, reduced efficiency, and forced German commanders to allocate scarce resources to defend installations that pre-war doctrine had considered secure from air attack. Between July 1943 and July 1944, the regiment's operational record intersected with the Soviet state's recognition system in ways that highlighted both risk and achievement. A wallboard at a sector air headquarters displayed Hero of the Soviet Union citations alongside casualty lists organized by quarter. The contrast revealed a stark operational calculus. Small aircraft, small bombs, yet 23 HSU awards would eventually accrue to the regiment. Cumulative combat deaths numbered approximately 30 to 32 across the entire war, a loss rate that, when measured against total sorties, remained notably low. Polina Gelman, Nadezhda Popova, and Irina Sabrova appeared among the awardees, their names linked to sortie counts that ran into the hundreds. Award orders documented specific engagements, leadership under fire, and sustained operational performance. Casualty registers recorded fallen crews by date, cause, and location. The juxtaposition of decoration and loss underscored the operational environment, persistent exposure to risk, but within a flight regime, low altitude, low speed, darkness, dispersed basing, that provided measurable survivability advantages. Deriving losses per 1,000 sorties from end-state totals required accounting for weather-related accidents, navigation errors in poor visibility, light anti-aircraft fire, and rare successful intercepts. The regiment's cumulative sortie count by war's end would exceed 23,000, an extraordinary figure for a single regiment. Set against approximately 30 fatalities, the ratio suggested that the operational concept, while not eliminating risk, managed it effectively. Soviet Air Force summaries confirmed the regiment's redesignation as 46th Guards, a distinction granted to units demonstrating sustained excellence. The Guards title carried both prestige and material benefits, priority for awards, slightly enhanced supply allocations, and public recognition. The year of highest decoration density corresponded not to the introduction of new aircraft or significant tactical changes, but to peak sortie density during major offensives when the regiment sustained maximum operational tempo. The concentration of HSU awards reflected a deliberate Soviet policy of leveraging decorations as both recognition and mobilization tools. Combat units with high visibility, especially those embodying ideological narratives such as all-female formations, received disproportionate attention. The regiment's performance justified the recognition, but the state's willingness to grant such awards also served propaganda and morale objectives that extended beyond the tactical contributions of any single unit. A force organization chart from mid-1943 aligned the 3 women's aviation regiments formed under Order Number 99. The 586th Fighter Regiment flew Yak-1, Yak-7, and eventually Yak-9 aircraft in air defense roles. The 587th Bomber Regiment, later redesignated 125th Guards, operated P-2 twin-engine bombers in dive and level bombing missions. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, redesignated 46th Guards and nicknamed Taman for campaigns in that region, continued flying Po-2 biplanes. The chart also recorded a critical divergence from the original all-female mandate. The 586th became co-educational by late 1942, incorporating male mechanics and, eventually, a male commanding officer, Alexander Gridnev. The 587th, after Marina Raskova's death in a P-2 crash in January 1943, received Valentin Markov as regimental commander. Both adjustments reflected wartime pragmatism. Maintenance complexity for the Yak and P-2 exceeded what could be sustained by inexperienced female ground crews under combat conditions, and command succession favored officers with established operational records. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, however, retained command of the 46th Guards throughout the war, and the Night Bomber Regiment remained entirely female in all positions. Performance contrasts among the three regiments reflected their aircraft and missions. Yak fighters engaged in air defense, interception, and close air support, roles that placed them in direct combat with Luftwaffe fighters and subjected them to intense anti-aircraft fire. The P-2 bombers conducted tactical strikes requiring precision navigation, bombing accuracy, and coordination with ground forces, operating in heavily defended airspace. The Po-2 night bombers, by contrast, flew low-level harassment missions against rear targets under darkness, with sortie counts and cumulative presence, substituting for per-mission lethality. Unit histories show that the 586th and 125th Guards achieved respectable operational records with significant contributions to air defense and tactical bombing campaigns. Their sortie totals and tonnage dropped, however, fell short of the 46th Guards' cumulative output. Despite carrying the smallest bomb loads, the Night Bomber Regiment achieved the largest total sortie count among the three women's regiments, a function of aircraft simplicity, rapid turnaround, and a mission set that allowed continuous operations. The divergence between the all-female ideal and operational reality in two of the three regiments highlighted the tension between ideological goals and battlefield requirements. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment stood as the sole complete embodiment of the original Order No. 99 vision. The spring and summer of 1944 brought the regiment into the thick of Soviet offensive operations across Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually into Poland. Operational tempo surged as Red Army fronts advanced and the Wehrmacht conducted fighting withdrawals. The 46th Guards operated from a series of forward airstrips, often relocating within days to maintain proximity to the fluid front line. Missions expanded to include close coordination with ground forces, targeting German strongpoints, supply columns, and command posts identified by Army reconnaissance. A typical night during this period saw the regiment launch multiple waves. Crews flew circuits over assigned sectors, navigators marking targets with flares or noting landmarks visible in the summer twilight. Ground controllers passed updated target coordinates by radio as Soviet infantry and armor advanced. German rear areas, already strained by daylight air attacks and artillery, faced continuous night harassment that allowed no respite for logistics, command, or rest. The regiment's sortie count climbed steeply. Individual pilots and navigators logged totals that would have been considered career-defining in peacetime. Nadezhda Popova, for instance, would eventually record over 850 combat sorties. Polina Gelman's total approached similar figures. These numbers reflected not only individual endurance, but also the systemic capacity of the Po-2 platform and its ground support model to sustain high operational tempos without catastrophic attrition. German defensive measures evolved. Searchlight batteries intensified coverage, and light anti-aircraft guns concentrated around key installations. Night fighter patrols increased, though the Po-2's speed envelope continued to frustrate intercept attempts. The regiment adapted by varying approach routes, timing attacks to coincide with other Soviet air operations that saturated German defenses, and exploiting weather conditions, cloud cover, haze, moonless nights, that degraded German acquisition capabilities, while the Po-2 crews navigated by dead reckoning and terrain features. By midsummer 1944, the regiment had become a known factor in German defensive planning. Rear area commands allocated resources explicitly to counter night harassment. The diversion of anti-aircraft assets, searchlight units, and patrol forces represented a measurable cost imposed by a single regiment flying obsolete biplanes. The cumulative effect, sleep deprivation, logistics disruption, persistent low-level threat, demonstrated that operational persistence and frequency could compensate for limited individual sortie lethality in ways that conventional bombing doctrine had not fully anticipated. The regiment's advance across Eastern Europe brought it into new operational contexts. By late 1944, it operated over territories recently liberated or still contested, where German forces fought delaying actions and Soviet logistics stretched to sustain advancing armies. The operational environment placed new demands: longer flight legs to targets, less familiarity with local terrain, and German defensive belts that had evolved to address Soviet night harassment tactics. Crew losses during this period, while still proportionally low, began to mount in absolute terms. Navigation errors over unfamiliar ground led to disorientation and forced landings in contested areas. Light anti-aircraft fire, increasingly concentrated around critical nodes, claimed aircraft during final approach or egress. Weather in the autumn and winter of 1944 posed significant challenges. Icing conditions, low ceilings, and poor visibility stressed crews trained for operations in relatively clear conditions over familiar terrain. The regiment's maintenance cadre worked extended hours to keep aircraft serviceable. Wear accumulated on engines, airframes showed stress from repeated operations in rough conditions, and spares availability fluctuated as supply lines stretched westward. Ground crews continued to practice battlefield maintenance, patching fabric, swapping engines between airframes, improvising repairs with available materials, but the cumulative effect of sustained operations showed in rising non-mission capable rates. Despite these pressures, the regiment maintained operational output. Commanders adjusted tactics to mitigate risk, shifting attack windows to avoid peak German alert periods, concentrating effort on targets where reconnaissance indicated reduced defenses, and pulling back crews who showed signs of exhaustion. The balance between mission demands and crew preservation became more delicate as the war entered its final phases. Soviet offensive operations in Poland and East Prussia required sustained air support. The 46th Guards contributed by maintaining night pressure on German logistics and rear installations, disrupting rest cycles for Wehrmacht units, withdrawing under Red Army pursuit. After-action reports noted that the regiment's persistent presence complicated German efforts to organize coherent defensive lines as rear-area chaos fed forward into tactical disorganization. The cumulative sortie count continued to climb, even as individual crews faced increasing risk from both operational demands and a German defense that had learned, if not to counter the Po-2 effectively, at least to impose higher costs on Soviet night operations. The final year of the war brought the regiment across the Vistula through East Prussia and eventually into the approaches to Germany itself. Operational tempo remained high as Soviet fronts closed on Berlin. The regiment flew from airstrips in Poland and East Prussia, continuing night harassment missions against German rear areas, logistics, nodes, and retreating columns. By early 1945, cumulative wear on aircraft, engines, and crews was evident. The Po-2 biplanes, designed for training flights of modest duration, had been subjected to years of combat operations. Fabric required patching, metal fittings showed fatigue, and engines approached or exceeded their intended service lives. Ground crews performed miracles of maintenance, but the fleet's material condition reflected sustained operational stress. Crew fatigue posed a parallel challenge. Pilots and navigators who had begun the war in 1942 had logged thousands of hours under combat conditions. The psychological toll of sustained despite these strains. The 46th Guards maintained its mission. Sorties continued through the winter and into the spring of 1945. German defensive belts, now compressed and under overwhelming Soviet pressure, still required nightly attention. Rear area disruption remained tactically valuable even as the broader strategic picture turned decisively against Germany. On May 2, 1945, Berlin fell. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment ceased combat operations on May 9th as Germany surrendered. The final tally, over 23,000 combat sorties flown, more than any other Soviet aviation regiment documented in comparable detail. 23 Hero of the Soviet Union Awards, the highest Soviet military decoration. Approximately 30 to 32 combat fatalities across nearly 4 years of sustained operations. The numbers, stark and factual, defined the regiment's war. No single mission changed the course of the conflict. No individual sortie delivered decisive effects. Yet the cumulative impact, rest denied, logistics disrupted, rear areas rendered insecure, contributed measurably to Soviet operational success across multiple fronts. The regiment's sustained presence imposed costs on German forces that reverberated through command decisions, resource allocations, and unit effectiveness. The Po-2, obsolete by any conventional metric, proved that in the right tactical context, simplicity and persistence could achieve effects disproportionate to the platform's inherent capabilities. The post-war period brought demobilization and a return to civilian life for most of the regiment's personnel. Pilots, navigators, armorers, and mechanics who had spent years under combat conditions faced the challenge of reintegration into a Soviet Union devastated by war. Some remained in military aviation, others returned to interrupted educations, factory work, teaching, or family life. Official recognition followed the regiment's dissolution. The Hero of the Soviet Union awards granted during the war carried material benefits, pensions, housing priority, public acknowledgement, but also positioned recipients as exemplars within Soviet propaganda narratives. The all-female composition of the 46th Guards made it particularly valuable for post-war messaging about Soviet women's contributions to victory. Memoirs, interviews, and official histories emphasized the regiment's achievements, while often simplifying the operational complexities and doctrinal innovations that had made its success possible. The Po-2 itself transitioned back to its original roles. Post-war Soviet aviation shifted rapidly toward jet fighters, strategic bombers, and helicopters. The fabric biplane, which had served as trainer, crop duster, liaison aircraft, and night bomber, returned to civilian and utility functions. Few airframes survived into museum preservation, and those that did often underwent restoration that altered or replaced original components. Veterans of the regiment maintained contact through the post-war decades, organizing reunions and corresponding regularly. Polina Gelman, Nadezhda Popova, Irina Sebrova, and others lived into the post-Soviet era, some into the 21st century, granting interviews that provided first-hand accounts of their wartime experiences. These oral histories, combined with archival records, allowed historians to reconstruct the regiment's operational details with greater accuracy than contemporary propaganda accounts permitted. Western awareness of the night witches, the nickname German soldiers reportedly gave to the Po-2 crews, grew slowly. English-language scholarship on Soviet women's military service remained limited through the Cold War. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and subsequent opening of archives enabled more detailed research. By the early 21st century, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment had become a subject of popular history books, documentary films, and academic studies. In February 2013, the Russian Federation issued a commemorative postage stamp honoring the night witches. The design featured a Po-2 silhouette against a night sky, a visual representation that simplified the regiment's operational reality into an iconic image. By that point, few veterans remained alive. Nadezhda Popova had died in 2013 at age 91, having spent decades after the war speaking about her experiences. Polina Gelman lived until 2005. Irina Sebrova survived until 2000. The historical legacy of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment rests on documented facts that resist both dismissive minimization and uncritical glorification. The unit flew an obsolete aircraft in a secondary tactical role. It did not engage in air-to-air combat, did not drop heavy bombs on strategic targets, and did not operate the sophisticated aircraft that dominate popular narratives of air warfare. Yet it achieved operational effects disproportionate to its platform and mission through sustained presence, high sortie rates, and the exploitation of tactical advantages inherent in its constraints. The regiment's all-female composition, while ideologically significant, reflected wartime pragmatism as much as revolutionary intent. Order Number 99 authorized women's regiments at a moment when Soviet military losses demanded maximal mobilization of all available human resources. The Night Bomber Regiment succeeded not because its personnel were women, but because its mission, platform, and tactical doctrine aligned in ways that allowed a simple aircraft and well-trained crews to impose cumulative costs on an enemy that struggled to counter the threat effectively. Archives preserve the operational records, sortie counts, bomb tonnages, casualty figures, award citations, and after-action reports. These documents confirm what veterans described in memoirs and interviews: long nights over contested territory, repeated missions under anti-aircraft fire, navigational challenges, mechanical failures overcome by field maintenance, and a cumulative output that exceeded what any contemporary observer would have predicted from a regiment of fabric biplanes. The memory of the night witches endures because the documented facts are sufficiently remarkable that they require no embellishment. 23,000 sorties over nearly 4 years of combat operations, 32 fatalities, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, 1 regiment, flying obsolete aircraft, maintaining operational pressure night after night across multiple fronts, imposing costs that German rear area commanders documented in their own reports. Marina Raskova did not survive to see the regiment's full wartime record. Her P-2 crashed in a snowstorm near Saratov in January 1943, while she commanded the 587th Bomber Regiment. Yet the organizational framework she established The training pipeline she designed and the operational concept she helped develop at Engels in late 1941 and early 1942 enabled the 46th Guards to sustain its remarkable performance through May 1945. The Po-2 biplanes are gone, the airstrips overgrown, the veterans past. What remains are the records, flight logs, casualty lists, award orders, German situation reports noting night harassment, and Soviet operational summaries tallying cumulative effects. These documents, stripped of propaganda and viewed in aggregate, reveal a tactical innovation born of necessity, sustained by persistence, and validated by measurable operational outcomes. The Night Witches flew into history not through individual heroics or technological sophistication, but through the disciplined application of available resources to a mission that exploited their constraints as advantages.